Okay. All right. Well, welcome everyone. We'll go ahead and get started. My name is Andrea Fowler. I'm the Assistant Director at the Center for South Asia. Thank you all for joining us today. Just two really short announcements before we get started. For the IS 320 students, please make sure that you have signed in using the QR codes stationed around the room. And if you are not already on our mailing list, you can also use that same QR code to sign up to receive emails on the center's activities. And or you can speak to Shahana or myself about getting added to that email list as well. Also, a short reminder, next Thursday, February 20th, also in June, please join us for a presentation by Professor Emeritus Ulrike Niklas. The talk, INR and his devotees, a glimpse into South Indian village religion, will be held online, and you can register to receive the Zoom link on our website, also available through that QR code. So now to today's event. Format for today's talk will be approximately 40 to 45 minutes of presentation by our guest speaker, followed by Q&A. So please hold your questions until the end of the presentation. For anyone who's attending virtually, you can drop your questions into the Q&A. We ask that all participants help us to create a safe space for learning and exchange and engage respectfully with the speaker and the other participants. For those attending in person, we would also like to note that the mics for hybrid participation, which have been installed throughout the room, are very sensitive. While the speaker mic or the podium serves as the primary audio channel for our recording and live cast, these mics are designed for full two-way communication and are able to pick up some noises. So we just ask you to bear this in mind and try to minimize the actual noise. Now, please note we will also be live broadcasting the Q&A, but we will not be part of the final recording that goes on our YouTube channel. It is now my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Arun Luthra. Arun is one of New York's premier saxophonists, an award-winning composer, and exponent of conical, carnatic music art form of vocalizing rhythms. As the leader of his conical jazz project, he is one of the small group of American musicians at South Asian that continue to explore the possibilities of fusing jazz with elements of classical music, as well as drawing from the myriad cultures that tradition bodies to create a vibrant new sound and style. He has performed with his conical jazz project across the United States, as well as in Japan, United Kingdom, Europe, Australia, and South America. In 2021, as a UW-Madison Division of Arts interdisciplinary resident artist, he performed in collaboration with members of the School of Music faculty and student communities, including as a featured performance at the 49th Annual Conference on South Asia. And he recently joined the jazz faculty here at UW-Madison. I know you will all enjoy today's presentation, the history of blending Indian musics with jazz and Black American music. Please help me welcome Arun Luthra.
Hello to the millions of people watching across the world online. Before I begin, I want to be sure to offer my heartfelt thanks to the Center for South Asia, Anthony, Andrea, Sarah Beckham, and everyone at the center for inviting me to present here. I thought it would be wise, given that this is an eminent institution of higher education, that I am presenting from the perspective of a practicing artist. I'm not a musicologist, I'm not a historian, I'm not a political scientist. So this is really coming from the point of view of a practicing artist, my experiences, my apprenticeships with elder masters, what I've learned through my development as an artist. So, you know, just to kind of preface my presentation with that in mind, because I'm sure all of you as more scholarly folks than me, you know, might have other approaches and other kind of perspectives on the subjects that I want to present today. So this subject is near and dear to my heart. You know, as you heard, I'm of South Asian heritage. My father's family comes from Punjab. I'm also a child of colonialism because my grandfather, my paternal grandfather and grandmother emigrated from Punjab to British East Africa, and that's where my father was born. So I'm, you know, so my family is part of this South Asian diaspora that was a result of the British Empire. And then I was born in the United States, raised in Europe, and so I have a strong kinship to Francophone culture and also to British culture. And there are elements of you know, East African culture that kind of imbued into my family culture. You know, like our language is peppered with Swahili words, and both my mother and father spent a lot of time in colonial Africa during their formative years. So this is all part of you know, as I said, as the introduction said, you know, the cultures that I embody. In addition to which, I fell in love with Black American music at a very young age. I fell in love with Bessie Smith, and I fell in love with Thelonious Monk. I fell in love with John Coltrane. So, as an artist, I'm also a practitioner of Black American music. And you know, I think it's very important to be explicit about that, right? That this is a culture that I fell in love with, and all of the historical, cultural, political dynamics that implies are important to be mindful of as we discuss this subject. So one of the first things that I wanted to mention was the idea of the perception of South Asian music in North America, in Europe, and this notion of exoticism. And so there are a couple, well, three examples that I have queued up here that to me really show the idea of kind of from a Western, North American, European perspective, having this idea of what the East is, right? Orientalism, you know, and these kinds of things, stereotypes that have nothing to do with actual engagement with the culture, right? So Duke Ellington's Far East Suite was composed after the Ellington Band did a State Department tour across several Asian countries. And there are a couple of pieces from the suite that are particularly, you know, to his mind, were evocative of South Asia. This piece is called Agra. So I'll just play a little bit of this. Oh, sorry. But first, there's an Allstate commercial. Okay, I think this might be an issue throughout the presentation, so I have to apologize in advance here. You got it from yourself? Oh, this is tourist point of view, so I have to change tracks. One more time, here we go. So just in the interest of time, I don't want to belabor this point, but you know, I'm even looking at the album cover, right? You have kind of this stereotype of the snake charmer and the painted elephant, all these ideas of what is evocative of the East in the European and the North American mind. And the other point to make is that from just a music point of view, what we just heard sounds nothing like the music you would expect folks who actually live in Agra to make, right? It's cinematic, it's evocative, right? It's meant, I think that's the intention behind it. This is a piece called Bluebird of Delhi. Again, very cinematic gestures, stereotypical gestures that you'd never hear in actual South Asian music. So wonderful, not very South Asian to my ears, right? And then my favorite example, just because it's so egregious, it's the Tommy Dorsey Band, you know, and so, you know, thinking about the category of what is Black American music, right? So I think of it as a lineage that's existed in North America, and Whether we're talking about the swing era, or we're talking about bebop, we're talking about ragtime, we're talking about hip hop. This is the lineage of Black American music. And many folks who are not Black American have been, what can I say, exponents of that culture, right? So I think Tommy Dorsey is a good example of that, right? One of the big swing stars of the era, a white musician, but who loved the music and devoted his artistic life to it. So this is called Song of India, which actually, interestingly enough, is based on a melody composed by Rimsky-Korsakov, and I think it so perfectly embodies this idea of exoticism and how, you know, as a North American, like the global North had this perception of what the East is. So again, not to belabor the point, right? But to me, this is a good starting point for what we're talking about, right? So the first thing is, you know, if we're going to incorporate South Asian musics into our artistic practice, well, we want to actually engage with the culture and actually learn what this music is about. And then this is actually something else that I'd like to point out. So this is studio guitarist Tommy Tedesco. He's a legendary figure in the recording business in the United States. There was a famous group of studio musicians in Los Angeles in the 1960s, 1970s, who played on all these hit records with the Beach Boys and, you know, Nancy Sinatra and whatever, like pretty much any song you can name that was recorded in Los Angeles in the 1960s, these musicians played on it. And to me, what he's about to say here, to me, is also just perfectly emblematic of these attitudes that we need to be aware of and transcend in terms of approaching the music of other cultures and incorporating them into artistic practice.
He arranged his seminars on weekends so that he could be home during the week in case there was any calls.
Let me give you what I call the freedom studio guitar player. About a year ago, I got the call to do a John Denver special. It was John Denver in Mexico, and they wanted some, he was on a fishing vessel, they wanted some Mexican music, so I gave him this. I called them Charlie's Angels, they were in Puerto Rico. They were Puerto Rican music, so I gave them this. Starsky and Hutch was in a big revolt in Bolivia. They wanted Bolivian music.
So I find that deeply insulting, right? If you're Bolivian, if you're Puerto Rican, if you're Mexican, and you hear a white musician making lots of money playing music say that, that's offensive, right? And I think it's emblematic again of one of the attitudes and the historical concepts we have to transcend when we're talking about this subject. And I think a lot of musicians in the global North, if you want to call it that, have these attitudes. They don't engage with the culture. So when we talk about actually engaging with the culture, one of the fundamental ideas of engaging with the culture is to understand that in South Asian classical tradition, we have two main schools, right? We have the Hindustani tradition, which is associated with the geographical North, and the Carnatic tradition. I don't know if we necessarily need to a lot of you I'm sure know this already, but I just pulled up a couple of videos that are tutorials about this, right? And explains how there are different practices which are, which define these two traditions. The instruments are different. We associate the tabla with Hindustani music, the mridangam with Carnatic music, these kind of things, right? So actually really seriously engaging with the culture. Another aspect of, I would say, the failure to engage with the culture fully, I came across an interesting blog post where it was talking about John Coltrane, who's one of the revered figures in Black American music, one of the great, you know, the great ancestors of Black American music. And he fell in love with Indian music. He was friends with Ravi Shankar. He named his son after Ravi Shankar. His son, Ravi Coltrane, is named after Ravi Shankar. So he really fell in love with the culture. He wanted to engage with it. And if we go through his notes, his archives, we can find a fundamental misunderstanding in the term of what the term rag or raga actually means. So I wanted to show you this. There's a couple of images of actually handwritten notes by John Coltrane. And so this is from his notebook, and he's actually written scales. And he talks about night, power, majesty, which is associated with this Hindustani classical idea of certain rags are meant to be played in the morning or the night, this kind of thing. And the idea that, oh, these are scales that I can play to evoke these things, or this is how this particular musical culture evokes these feelings or these times of day and night. There's also this, which is a lot harder to read. But he actually names it Rag Tori, and if you know the rags, you'll see that, oh, there is actually some correlation between what Coltrane wrote in his notebook and what the rags actually are. So I think it would be fruitful to listen to this tutorial on what actually a rag is, and this common misconception of that is common in Western musicians for Western musicians. So here we go. All right.
Now coming back to the question, what is rag? Well, in the simplest terms, rag means a melody which is used to express a feeling. Now you will ask, what is a melody? Melody is a ear-pleasing combination of musical notes. But mind you that a rag is not a very random combination or a random melody. To understand the concept of rag, you will have to understand the three layers which form a rag.
I'm sorry.
5 minutes ago, she never played piano.
There are three steps in the formation of a rag. The first step is understanding that rag is a set of notes arranged in an ascending and a descending order. The ascending order is called as aroha, while the descending order is called as avroha. There have to be minimum 5 notes in the ascending and 5 in the descending. The number of notes in a rag determine what we call as the jati of.
Okay, so then I'll skip
now
to the next
comes
part.
Step number 2. The second step is knowing that every rag has a chalan, or there are rules when it comes to combination of notes. For Western music students, this is exactly the difference between the Western concept of scale or mode and the Indian concept of rag. When it comes to a scale or mode, you can have the combination of any note with any note in the set. While in rag, you can't combine randomly. There are specific rules, and at the same time, there are key phrases or key combination of notes that one has to use, one cannot omit, because these phrases or combination of musical notes give rag its identity.
So that is a key
Now,
point. And then lastly,
well, at this point, the third step is very important. A rag is not complete without the use of specific ornamentation in the rag. In classical singing, in the singing of rag, the ornamentation of kadaswar is very important. Now, the notes in a rag are not taken plainly. They have kada or the touch of other surrounding notes, and that is what gives the beauty to the note. Now, for example, I will not sing the rag yaman plainly. This becomes very plain, but using the kadaswar, it becomes.
so very brief, but so this idea that, we look at Coltrane's understanding of what, he's like, oh, this rock thing is so cool. What are the scales of the rag, right? A rag is not a scale. It's much, much more than that. So, when we listen to Coltrane's music and his engagement with these South Asian traditions, a lot of that is missing, right? And, in some ways that's a criticism of Coltrane, but of course, that doesn't diminish at all Coltrane's importance and significance and his greatness as a musician, right? Just in this particular area, I think we can go deeper, I guess is what I'm saying. Coltrane could have gone deeper. Okay, so another aspect of the story that I think is worth sharing is how was Black American music, or jazz in particular, introduced to South Asia? And it is an interesting story. In the research that I did, that I have done and that I was doing for this lecture, a lot of it, of course, is associated with imperialism and colonialism. And what we find is that there were jazz bands that we would, like a sound that we would associate with, for example, Chicago in the 1920s. There's the famous story of Louis Armstrong being called by King Oliver to come up to Chicago to play, right? And these dance bands, these swing bands, these jazz bands that were playing in Chicago, well, that music, you could hear it across the world because of colonialism. And these fancy hotels in Mumbai and these other places would have bands for people to dance to. Because of the apartheid of colonialism, that music was really for the colonists and not for and wasn't accessible to the people who actually lived in these countries. But the music was there, and that's something that I think is left out of a lot of stories. We don't think about that. Like, oh, could we actually hear jazz in India in 1930? Could we? Yes, we could in the 1940s. There are South Asian musicians who fell in love with the music and became exponents of the music, in addition to which there were musicians from the global north, from North America especially, who migrated to Asia and had careers there. I thought I would share a couple of examples of that just because they're very striking, and I think for a lot of us are actually surprising. So here's a band, and actually if you look, I think you can see it. It says Calcutta here on the record label, right? So this is a jazz record that was made in South Asia, actually. The King's Grand Hotel Orchestra. Here's another orchestra called the John Abriani Six, who were also playing in these fancy hotels for dancers. And in my research, I found a lot of information on musicians, particularly from Goa, who became jazz musicians and were playing in these big hotels. This is interesting. This is there's no audio here, but this is actually so this is in Paris, but this is one of the bands that would tour in India. So Leon Abi's orchestra, and just so you can get a sense of, okay, imagine these musicians playing at a fancy hotel in Mumbai or Calcutta. This is what you saw, which is just like what we'd expect to see in Chicago or Paris or anywhere else, actually, right? And the way they're dressed, the instruments they're playing, you can imagine what the sound of the music was. So this is very interesting to me because it really speaks to how African American culture, Black culture, was already spreading. And Black music is kind of the common soundtrack of the world now, right? Anywhere you go, whether it's like K-pop, or you go to, you go to Colombia and listen to pop music there, anywhere you go, there's this deep, Afro-diasporic influence in the pop music of the world, right? And we see this in the early 20th century already, right? Thanks to technology, recordings, and the ability to travel and all these kinds of things. This is another band that was known to play in the fancy hotels in India. I mean, that sounds, like I said, like just like what you hear if you went to hear Louis Armstrong play or King Oliver, right, in Chicago or somewhere like that. So it's interesting to consider, what were musicians, what were just people in South Asia during this period thinking about this music, and were they falling in love with it? Did they want to play it too? These were new instruments that maybe weren't being introduced. The saxophone wasn't a common instrument in South Asia. Maybe the piano wasn't either, right? And eventually, through colonialism, we get this introduction of these instruments and this way of playing them, which comes from African American culture. This figure here, Chick Chocolate, that was his nickname, his stage name. He's an interesting figure because he's an example of a South Asian musician who embraced the music and became famous for playing it. There's not a lot I could find on him in terms of listening to his music, but this is a mural that someone painted in tribute to him. And I'm pretty sure this is him on trumpet. He was a trumpeter. So here's an example of actually a South Asian musician who embraced the music and became an exponent of it. So when you hear the trumpet come in, here it comes. So this is interesting on multiple levels. One is that according to the history that I've learned, folks considered that he had a resemblance to Louis Armstrong. So he was kind of thought of as the Louis Armstrong of India or South Asia. This particular recording is later, you can tell, right? There's a backbeat, it's more of like a 1950s, 1960s kind of groove. But the progression, for those of you who know, was a 12-bar blues. I mean, that's Black culture right there, right? So also you can hear how he's imitating trumpeters like Cootie Williams, who was in the Ellington band, right? And these expressive techniques of growling and using the plunger and these kind of things, right? So already we're seeing, this strong influence of Black culture on South Asian musicians. Interestingly, Chick Chocolate was known to play in the hotels in the 1920s, 1930s, but eventually that work dried up, especially after Indian independence. And he became a music director for Bollywood films. So you can find recordings where he's the music director, but he's actually playing on. Maybe he was the arranger, right? He would become an orchestrator for violin sections and things like that. So there's not a lot of his playing that you can hear on record. But that's where his career went after after his jazz career dried up. Then another figure that is interesting and not widely known is Teddy Weatherford, who was an African musician from Virginia who actually made his home in Asia. He migrated there. And I was able to find this recording of him, which was not made in Asia, but you get a sense of what kind of player he was. And it's quite wonderful. So to my ears, this is on par with any record by Earl Hines or someone like that you might have heard in the United States. And it's, to me, it's really magical to think about folks in South Asia hearing this music, right? And it going across the world, and them being influenced by it. Okay, so to me, that's a really interesting and key part of the story is kind of, that the influences in both directions, right? So we have, because of colonialism and imperialism, we have music from the global north expanding across the world, and African-American culture is actually arriving in South Asia and influencing musicians, and musicians are falling in love with it. Historically, I learned that this work dried up, especially after independence, and the notion of jazz became very elitist. It was for the wealthy, and it was for the white folks. So there wasn't a lot of grassroots involvement with the jazz tradition after a certain point. Whereas there might have been more when you could get a job, let's say playing in a hotel, right? So you could be the trumpet player, the saxophone player, the bassist in a hotel orchestra. So there's kind of a dry period. And the next part of the story, which is intriguing to me, is now we think about the introduction of South Asian musical traditions to Europe and North America. Part of the story is actually not, it's not related to Black American music. So one aspect of it is a violinist by the name of Yehudi Menuhin. Is that a name anybody here is familiar with? So he was known as a superstar in the European classical world. And he encountered specifically Hindustani classical music and really fell in love with it and was knocked out by it. So he, because of his fame and his access, he was able to invite musicians to come from India. He was able to go to India and learn from them. So he is actually a very important figure in the introduction of specifically Hindustani music to Europe and North America. One interesting story with regards to that is there was a, hold on a second here, let me just find it. So there was an organization called the Asian Music Circle. One point to make, and I'm sure a lot of you know this already, but in British English, the term Asian refers to South Asia, unlike in US English. So, so the Asian Music Circle meant music from South Asia. As a quick little tangent, one of the co-founders of the Asian Music Circle, Ayana Deva, who went by the name Raj Hansa, he wrote political pamphlets. He went to he emigrated to the UK to study because he wanted to join the British Civil Service in India. Actually, this kind of my grandfather's story too. He thought that the way to economic opportunity was to join the British Civil Service, whether it was in India or in the Empire. So he comes to Britain and he gets totally radicalized and becomes a Trotskyist, and he's totally anti-imperialist. And he forms this Asian Music Circle. And Yehudi Menuhin in 1953 became president of the Asian Music Circle. So that was, he was someone who, like I said, was really a champion for South Asian music in European and white circles. The British composer Benjamin Britten was vice president for the Asian Music Circle as well. So this is interesting, right? So we're just seeing how when famous, powerful white folks dig something, all of a sudden you can get to see it everywhere, right? Because they become champions for it. And in connection with that, Yehudi Menuhin wanted to stage a festival which he called the Living Arts Festival. And he was able to get funds from the Ford Foundation to create this, to put on this festival and have South Asian musicians come and present their music in the West, specifically at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. And this is related to this particular thing here. So the timing doesn't quite match because from what I've been able to learn, the Living Arts Festival was in 1955 and this is from 1957. But I'm wondering if there's some confluence here, where the reason these musicians were in New York City at that time was because of the festival. And what's really wonderful about this, and I was so just thrilled when I found this, is these are some folks hanging out at someone's apartment in New York City, getting together to play. So we have Ravi Shankar here, and he's presenting his music, and who else was there? well, kind of a who's who. You've got Dizzy Gillespie right there. So there's hanging out, like looking cool, wearing their suits, smoking their cigarettes, you know. And it was this, in some ways I can imagine, it was this introduction, jazz music, many jazz introduction to this music, this South Asian musical tradition, which they'd never encountered before. As a quick little aside, let's see, how can I say this? I think it's important to be mindful of the fact, to be very explicit about the fact that, what can I say? South Asian classical musicians tend to come from elite, privileged parts of society. And these rich white folks who are falling in love with South Asian music, they're also privileged and have access and have resources. So we also have to, I think it's important to keep in mind that these privileged communities have certain attitudes and perspectives which come across in the way they talk about the music, in the kinds of in the choices they make, and this kind of thing. And there's a particular part of this story which jumped out at me. And it's also, I think, speaks to the, probably, let's see, I don't have the name of the writer of the article, but probably, you know, the perspective and privilege of the person who wrote this little blurb in the magazine. So it says here, the jazz experts were deeply impressed by Shankar's ragas because just as US jazz has improvisational flights, his Eastern music improvises on traditional themes and rhythms. So already I get the sense there's kind of an exoticism in the, oh, these delightful Eastern themes, you know, that the article writer is kind of, you know, expressing that attitude. And then here we see, but though the ragas are far more complicated and refined than even the best Western jazz, Shankar said happily, I love jazz. Its wild rhythm is so much like our Indian folk music. To my ears, that is dripping with condescension and racism, anti-Black racism. And that is reflective of the circles, you know, the circles that the people who make this music come from, right? There's another example of that from Ravi Shankar, which I can present to you later. So I think it's important also to keep that in mind. I can also speak from personal experience. I've been very fortunate to learn from and collaborate with some of the most eminent Carnatic musicians and Hindustani musicians. And very often when I'm in the room with them, and let's say they say, oh, Arun, I wrote a jazz piece we can play together. And what they've come up with has nothing to do with jazz. And in their mind, jazz is this thing where you just kind of just play whatever you want. You just jam. There's no vernacular, there's no grammar, there's no discipline, there's no refinement. It's just this thing that you do for fun kind of thing, right? Whereas our music is so refined and so, you know, and so sophisticated, right? So these ideas are inherent in these attitudes are inherent in these musical communities very often. And I think that has had an impact in how these musics have affected each other and how the cross-pollination has occurred. Okay. So we have Yehudi-Menyen, we have the Asian Music Circle, and this is, you know, 1950s. We're starting to see this influence. Another part of kind of the more political side of this, which is important for me to me is important. This is a quote from a book about the introduction of Indian music to the West, and the quote is, Menyen also recognized the level of technical skill and sensitivity required for Ravi Shankar and tabla player Chatur Lal to interact spontaneously with each other and perform their instruments with such agility. Yehudi, who had risen to the highest echelon of Western musicians, had come face to face with a tradition centuries older than his own. Suddenly, he was forced to take stock of his own limitations as a musician, who had spent his entire life as an interpreter, never having attempted the art of improvisation. So we can also imagine, you know, Yehudi-Menyen is this celebrated, revered figure in his world, and all of a sudden, I guess to his credit, he had the perspective, the humility to say, wait a minute, I think I'm all that. Well, there's a lot of other music out there, and it's just as sophisticated and wonderful as what I know, right? And this default of, you know, European music is the best, or classical music is the best, right? That's a very common attitude that I've encountered. And it's really important, you know, to recognize that and to say, oh, wait a minute, you know, that's not true. And We see it from the perspective of white musicians as they look at the music from other cultures, but then we also see it in elite South Asian circles, in my experience, which I find quite heartbreaking. And it's also worth pointing out the northern part of South Asia is much more prominent in Europe and North America, much better known. And I think that's largely because of U.W-Madison and his introduction of Ravi Shankar, all of Akali's people to audiences, and a lot of Carnatic musicians just were not known to U.W-Madison and folks like that. Okay, so now we get to kind of the heart of the question, which is, okay, but then we talked about the South Asian, South Asians being exposed to Black American music. Okay, that's the one direction. But now what about Black American musicians discovering South Asian music, falling in love with it, wanting to incorporate it into their musical practice? So, and I realized, wow, time's flying by. Holy moly! So again, taken from this book that I got a lot of information from. It's useful to think about why might musicians who play Black American music be even interested at all in South Asian music. From this book, I think this is a worthwhile quote. It says, while a handful of Western classical players, like U.W-Madison, for example, discovered a kinship with the emphasis in Indian music on virtuosity and discipline, but that's almost as if to say other musics don't have that, right? It's like, are you saying there's no virtuosity and discipline in Black American music or other musics, just Indian classical music and European classical music? And rock musicians empathize with its improvisational freedom and alternative spirituality. The jazz tradition identified with Indian music across the board. Not only could jazz musicians appreciate the importance of improvisation and the technical brilliance in Indian classical music, but they also identified with the spiritual values, the common bond between musicians of different backgrounds, and a spirit of reverence towards the act of making music. And then it's worth also just elucidating some of the parallels between what we think of as jazz and what we think of as Indian classical music. They're both soloistic and improvisational. We think about that in both those traditions. They often emphasize a particular individual, right? So, and that's another way of saying it, they're soloistic. And they demand fluency on one instrument as a vehicle of self-expression, in the sense that as an interpreter, right, let's say I'm playing a violin concerto, I'm expressing a composer's vision through my instrumental prowess. Whereas as an improviser, in a jazz context or in a Hindustani or Carnatic context, it's also about expressing my own perspective, right? So it's more individual. Both strive to emulate the sound of the human voice with instruments through ornamentation and systematic use of microtonal inflection. So I think this is a really key point. It's incredibly challenging. I've tried to do it, and I decided I just didn't have enough lifetimes to actually do it. But to play, what we saw in terms of the ragas and the rag and the ornamentation in the previous video, trying to do that on Western instruments like a saxophone or a piano, it's incredibly difficult. It's a lifetime study. And I said, I just don't have time to do that. But because I'm a descendant culturally of Black American music, I fell in love with Aretha Franklin and Bessie Smith and B.B. King and all these folks. Well, that microtonal tradition I have absorbed. And the microtones that we hear in blues expression, maybe I'll throw out some names here that won't mean much to folks, but I think of a saxophonist like Stanley Turrentine, who's really renowned for his blues inflection, right? That is microtonal too, just from a different cultural perspective than the microtones of rock, right? So this microtonality, this idea of inflection bending notes, both of these traditions have it in common, although they think about it differently. And then the idea of spontaneous interaction between musicians, right? That's something that's common in both of these musical cultures. And then this is related to me personally in terms of how I have incorporated South Asian traditions into my own music making. Many jazz players have drawn upon the rhythmic and melodic language of Indian music, while Indian musicians working in jazz have liberated themselves from a fixed repertoire of ragas and talas musicians in both camps would discover colors and textures that opened new avenues of expression. So on the one hand, there's something really powerful about that, right? Which is that, oh, okay, I'm in this classical tradition and these are the rules and I have to do this. Or if I'm, let's say, playing in, Art Blakey's Jazz Messengers, and this is what we do, right? Oh, but then I discover, oh, well, these musicians over here are doing this other thing and maybe I could do some of that. And then, the jazz musicians feel that about the Indian music and the Indian musicians feel that about jazz. So that's very liberating. I also think that we have to be careful, especially from the perspective of Indian classical musicians, that there can again be this idea of, oh, I love playing jazz because I can just do whatever I want. So much easier than playing Hindustani music or Carnatic music, right? So that undertone can be there, and we so I think it's important to guard against that. So yeah, we're really running over time, right? So here's the thing. Why don't I just play a clip with just some examples of how some of this music emerged. All right, this is Yusef Lateef, great jazz musician, one of the most revered figures in the music. So on this tune, he's playing Shehnai, which is a Hindustani instrument. Again, I know how short on time we are, and I think it's important to point out that the way he's playing Shehnai is not at all the way you expect to hear Shehnai play in a Hindustani context, right? So, excuse me, alarm going off. There's a doctoral student here in geography called Luke Levitt, who was actually my assistant during my residency. He coined the term lateral appropriation, which I thought was a really interesting idea, right? Which is, we could think about appropriation as being, the idea of, like in comedy, punching down, right? So I'm more powerful, I'm more privileged, and I steal your culture, take credit for it, right? But here we're thinking about, okay, an African-American musician appropriating an instrument from South Asia, and it's lateral, it's not punching up or punching down. But it's like, oh, this is interesting, let me try some of this, right? But at the same time, we could make the argument he's not really engaging with the culture that the music comes from, right? Because that's not really how you play Shehnai. Again, I had a lot more musical examples to play. One part of the story which I thought was really interesting was the Beatles fell in love with especially George Harrison really fell in love with the sitar and these Indian music traditions. And George Harrison played sitar on a couple of recordings, Norwegian Wood and Love You Too. And there is actually a quote, a Ravi Shankar quote, where he's asked, what did you think of George Harrison's sitar solo on Norwegian Wood?
Hi, this is Terry Gross. I want to thank you for visiting the Fresh Air.
So check it. I think this is hilarious.
HYY.
It was exactly what you were saying. They were confused and they were searching. But tell you truth, when I met them, I almost didn't know them or know anything about them. I just vaguely heard that it's a popular group. And it was in a party that all the
Okay, so I'll just fast forward.
were there, but so inquisitive and asking questions about us.
Okay, here.
What did you think of the solo he played on Norwegian Wood?
I never heard it before, and it was only much later on my nephew and nieces, they played for me, and I thought it was terrible in the sense, in the sound that was produced on the sitar. The song was nice. I liked the song very much, but it was a peculiar sound. It didn't sound like sitar. So he had little less
lesson from a person in London who is a student of mine, who was in London at that time. And I told him frankly that it's fine, if people like it and you are happy, but I didn't find it interesting enough because it's very sound of sitar, which is something which we have developed since last 750 years. And it seemed like taking the violin, someone in Africa sings an African song and it scratches on a violin. And how would you feel? Because you know what violin sounds like. And the sound of violin has immediate effect. So it was the same thing, but he understood. And that's
So I'll stop there, but two things. First of all, he's being honest. Okay, that was terrible, George Harrison. Kind of like maybe a Shehnai player would say about Yusef Lateef, like, what the heck is that? But then he can't help himself. To make the point of how terrible it was, he invokes Africa. To me, this undercurrent of anti-Black racism that exists in South Asian circles, right? And that to me is very heartbreaking to hear, right? So, I can open it up for questions, but of course now, we're decades later, there's a whole series of musicians who really embraced South Asian classical music practice from a rhythmic and a melodic perspective. I've learned the instruments. And then of course, South Asian musicians now have been invited to play with very eminent jazz musicians. So I think about Trilok Gurtu, who played with Joe Zawinul and then Badal Roy, who played with Miles Davis, and with Dave Liebman and these folks. And now, as the diaspora has evolved, we have musicians of South Asian heritage who actually have become jazz musicians and who were born and grew up in the global north, right, in North America and Europe. So they are bringing their own backgrounds into their music making, and maybe some of them are not at all explicitly incorporating elements of South Asian music into their jazz performances, but just by the virtue of the fact that they're South Asian, well, that becomes part of their part of what the music sounds like. Yes, so happy to open it up to any questions. Anybody? Thoughts, ideas? Okay.
So I was just thinking about, we were talking about earlier in your talk, this idea of, exchange and the way that, musicians would travel and the way music itself would travel. I was thinking about, today, platforms like YouTube and TikTok that are closing that distance gap. What do you see, or speculative or otherwise, as sort of where are those exchanges happening? Are they, because we're not seeing that happen in hotel ballrooms and dance orchestras the way it was happening 100 years ago, right? So what are your thoughts on how those exchanges are taking place 100 years later?
Well, on the one hand, it's very exciting. On the other hand, do you guys know the phrase that the recipes are being lost? There's an element of that. Because what I find is, especially I'm thinking about young South Asian musicians who fall in love with Black American music. But the YouTube algorithm, the TikTok algorithm is feeding them, okay, this is what rap is, this is what beatboxing is. And because that's their access to it, they don't know anything about the history and about the history of the musical tradition, or even who the people are who actually created it. And so you have maybe a South Asian beatboxer who says, oh, this cat from Austria is my favorite rapper or my favorite beatboxer. It's like, yeah, but come on, man. It's like, that's not where the music comes from. You know what I mean? So it's really a mixed bag, in my opinion. That it's wonderful that, oh, we have access to everything, but we have access to so much that we don't have an ability to distinguish what is significant, what is true, what is not true, so that we can really get to the heart of it. And that I find heartbreaking. It makes me sad when a young beatboxer doesn't know who Grandmaster Flash is, let's say. Like, you should know who that is, if that's the music that you want to play. That's like me not knowing who Louis Armstrong is. Come on. Or if you are a sitar player, not knowing who Ravi Shankar is. Like, you should know, right? That's part of the lineage of your instrument. Yeah.
Just a comment. In October, I was fortunate to have a meeting at the Taj Hotel in Mumbai, and they have these